freedom from contradiction. It is also so that they have a quality. You can never be confident that any part of any of them is irrelevant to any other.
So, just doing this on a spur of things and want to get this out while it's still freshly brewed in the head, freshly brewing cognition. and am relying mostly on some quick notes, some passages spoken by Oppenheimer. You know, if ever a time was right to start speaking about these things, it's now. Given that the slow revelation of obscure truths in our reality is coming to fruition beyond the parameters of some entertaining channels on YouTube. You know, shit's getting real. And when it comes to ideas like ancient technology, non-native intelligences, be it aliens or quote-unquote so-called artificial intelligence, or non-physical dimensions, etc., the phenomenal reality is slowly exposing itself to our perception as our perception steadily expands in its ability to receive the logos at greater depths. And as such, I thought it best with this solo symposium to speak toward the subjective-objective dynamic with evidence, perception, and role of intuition in science versus the paradigm of empiricism or empiricist science. That is to say, the difference between Chinese astronomers and polymaths who were tasked by the royalty of their time, in their respective times of the ancient world, to create technologies for mapping the cosmos and tracing time and predicting future outcomes. This birthed the first hydraulics-based technology thousands of years ago, versus the Mr. Daves of the current era, who would literally dismiss such a fact if spoken by anyone not approved by standard academia, forever favoring the modern narrative, which defaults to forget that such innovations ever took place in the ancient world. To illustrate this contrast of perspectival orientation, I will start with my personal experiences in current times. So my work professionally has traditionally been in the restaurant kitchen setting. And at that, I am all too familiar with enduring small-scale injuries perturbing enough to derail one's day, right? And I've experienced this where, you know, adrenaline, you're in a flow state, you don't realize until sometime after, that you've sustained an injury, and once you've realized it, that is when it hurts, right? Sometimes it's in reverse, right, where you heal yourself from the mind. If anyone's familiar with the Patch Adams story, circa 1999, I believe, a dramatic representation of the idea of how laughter heals. But it's based on a true story, based on a real guy, portrayed by the lovely and greatly missed Robin Williams. But yeah, you got laughter. You got healing in the form of laughter, right? You have phantom limb effect, right? We've all seen the videos where they put up a dividing barrier between your real hand and a false hand, and they poke and prod at the false hand enough that, you know, sufficiently such that while looking at them both, right, your brain is trained to believe in the false hand. It'll have no qualms with taking the false hand for the real one. And you will produce internal sensations accordingly. And this is what we're talking about when we talk about placebo, psychosoma, Wim Hof method, hypnosis to quit smoking. or other various addictions. If you've been watching the Untold channel since the early stages, you may have heard in one of the earlier lives, that Joey spoke on how he once was able to navigate, the world with an innate sense of direction, but now must rely on a GPS or other frames of reference, as though some quality or access to the morphic field or morphogenetic field was once potent but now deterred, if not completely severed, right? And these things are accessible to the daily living human experience at our scale of perception. Proof is not required here in terms of like a working equation or something, a materialistically provable hypothesis. It's non-existent, independent of human investigation. Proof is non-existent. It's manufactured as a result of zooming in on particular fractions of reality, rhyming with the observer effect, right? Where the wave collapses into a particle, right? Your pain, there is no pain until the injury is perceived as such, right? Your injury is in a wave state until observed, right? And that's when you feel it, once observed. And I've felt, in my own experience, I've had this where I've felt the effect of an injury. I've felt the post effect of injury. Well, I don't know, some time after the initial event, right? Where I'd suddenly realize, I'd look down and feel the sort of drippage, right? And I'd realize that, oh shit, I've cut myself, right? And it wasn't until then that the pain would set in, right? And the body literally waited for my awareness to collapse the waveform of the injury. This is the observer effect experienced at our scale of perception, right? So, yeah, it's very much a quantum effect observable at our scale, right? They say that you can't experience phenomena observed at the subatomic scale. It only exists as a product of extremely fine measurements taken with mathematical precision and such, right? But that's not true. Quantum phenomena are very much experienced in our daily lives if we just contextualize the experience in that way, right? So this relates to my notion of proofs, right? And evidence regarding scientism versus, an intuitive orientation in science. There are well-working philosophies against the very concept of proof. You have this argument, who's this Jacques Derrida? Language restricts perception due to its paradoxical limitations, right, inherently. But also over time, the way language transforms, it can eventually reveal this underlying utility or significance in those paradoxes that are not limiting. And that's when method comes in, right? In the realization that technology is a double-edged sword, and we've only learned to cut with one side, right? And language itself also is a double-edged sword, serving as either a cage or a chrysalis. That we depending on the way we use language, right? If we only use the scalpel of our mind to make material utility out of the scientific pursuit, that is to say, for what material gain can we use with the results of our scientific endeavors, right? And for some centuries now, this has been the central focal point of science. Which rhymes back to Oppenheimer's, the parameters of science are non-exclusive to each other as a whole. non-exclusive to each other as a whole, that you would more appropriately incorporate the use of intuition in your scientific endeavors, because adapting strictly a utilitarian lens is not only an incomplete picture, but it's so lacking in perception that it could be our own demise, future tragic end. At the same time, it's weird, right? Because like a lot of intuition can also be self-defeating, or at least the trajectory that we take it in, right? What's the point of a microwave oven now for humanity in 2025? Other than to fast track brownie desserts on a restaurant menu, and to keep the kids satisfied with Hot Pockets when we're too busy to cook nutritious meals, right? But I only say this because the effect of microwave emission on food was discovered intuitively. I think it was some guy discovered the effect of it after standing too close by with a Mr. Goodbar chocolate in his pocket. Yeah, and then he came to find, probably sometime later on when he went to go eat his Mr. Goodbar, right, that he couldn't because it got all melted out by the microwave emissions, probably in a laboratory setting. Can't remember, but now we, as a result of that, this guy named Spencer took the concept and developed it into the modern conventional piece of tech that we're all familiar with today, right? And now we have this useless justification for the existence of Hot Pockets, although it could save for people who don't want to spend 45 minutes waiting on a dessert in the restaurant. So sometimes intuition can also be directed into, the results of our intuitive discoveries can also be directed into a utilitarian, but like an arbitrary materialistic trajectory that is really, in the final analysis, just impertinent concerning the existential quandary we find ourselves in when we literally stop to just think about things for a moment, right? But all that set aside, intuition is great when you have, say, these various scientists like Newton or Einstein and others of the like, who, indeed, to my conclusions, arrived at their most popular, well-known ideas by way of intuition first, and then confirmed by experimental means after the fact. Right? So, in prefacing my point of scientism versus a genuine scientific pursuit, before making a full circle back to the point of, the role of evidence with relationship to, paradigms and such, Oppenheimer, his passage that I played at the beginning here, he's speaking from an intuitive standpoint. He's not speaking academically. When he says all scientific perspectives stem from a common matrix, that they share a baseline qualitative equivalence with each other. It's not a notion one arrives at by professing the existing perspectives that stem from a well-established academic paradigm. That's the result of the scalpel of the logical mind that requires we cut things apart to see inside, but does so on the presumption that further divisions into smaller fractions would somehow serve up a unified whole. It's not intuitive, but it's what's required when you're in the lab or in the classroom, right? At least for particular purposes, right? And that's the catch right there, right? What's the purpose? What's the telos? What's the teleological drive behind something, behind any expression of the logos trying to manifest itself forth into the world? I'm likely unconsciously borrowing from Watts or McKenna or somebody here from some lecture I've heard, but it's the scalpel of the mind when approaching science, or anything really. that separates the forms of reality in our perceptions, by way of the way we investigate it, right? But intuition seems to bind those forms of reality back together, seemingly appearing to be disparate on the surface of our experience. Our intuitions beckon we reintegrate them from the edges of the fractal edges we tore apart with our own cognition, with our own abstractions of reality. To reconstruct those fractions into unities, you don't do it with the scalpel of the mind, right? With logic, but with the intuition. Because the intuitive mind can see things for their contiguity. It sees the continuum the fractals all move along or rest upon as a dynamic process, right? Oppenheimer, being a quote-unquote, real scientist, to go as deeply as he did into the lab, into empirical metric, and to come to this conclusion that no quality of scientific investigation is irrelevant or exclusive to any other, is not because, when you go deep into the physical metric, it does nothing but separate reality into compartments, right? Saying magnetism here, electricity over here, organic matter over here, and inanimate matter over there, right? Confining our perception to specific domains of investigation, of understanding, inherently negating the presence of perspectives outside of each other's domains, or outside of our own domains, right? It seems the deeper that we observe any conditions in reality, the results tend to suggest otherwise, right? Intuition beckons we see these contiguities between differing qualities of reality, if not opposing, right? And arriving at this notion does not occur from strictly mathematically deduced hypotheses or empirically validated theorems, but with intuition. And Oppenheimer's life's work is a definitive example of this kind of science at hand, deriving first from an intuitive understanding, evolving into a world-destroying material force, right? Sharpening both sides of the blade, revealing the subatomic reality to the world by a most visceral means, right? This is what happens when you don't exclude aspects of reality from each other, right? But it's a double-edged sword, because as our sense of what the deeper reality is or can be, and what it is when it interfaces with our materialistic projections, the stakes rise on both sides of the equation, on both sides of the dynamic, right? So when investigating in particulars, things will always tend to particularize out, always branching out, essentially saying yet more unseen. But what lay in the dark out there, I don't think was ever really the answer to our inquiries, if genuine, right? Not way out at the end of those branches, but at the root, when you get down to the root, what brings those branches together into a tree, right? We have this one branch we call electricity, and this other branch we call magnetism. Or rather, you may call each branch its own tree, but what's the great root system underlying it all that brings them together into a unified sort of world tree, so to speak? You don't find it by climbing all the way out to the ends of the branches, but by investigating down at the very root that brings them together, which is not, currently anyway, the frontier of the scientific pursuit. Rather, it's empirical analysis. The empiricist scientific paradigm can only see a low-resolution slice of what weaves the pattern. In our esoteric circles, we have our various words for it. But with that said, about the difference between scientism and true intuitive scientific pursuit, there is a responsibility, right? So high in magnitude that we don't really understand fully the ramifications of what knowing more truly entails. It's an adventure that the destination is unknown to us. And whether knowing it or not, we're beckoned to investigate reality from an intuitive orientation, from a place of binding rather than separating, right? And what's happening here at Library and at the Discord server is interesting, because what's happening across the various channels utilizing these platforms to express their pursuit of understanding. We'll see this zooming in on things with specificity, right? To understand something better. When we zoom back out, the binding contiguities between any and all things, nothing is separate. And Oppenheimer's suggestion that we don't strictly investigate reality through an empirical lens, and I stress empirical here because, you'll have empiricists that aren't scientists who rely solely on not the empirical experience, because that's what we called gnosis, but of the empirical analysis offered by the scientific method. All right, so you have the proponents of science who rely solely on an empirical answer. But I see a way to connect not with science, but also not necessarily with mysticism either. We don't necessarily need to be realized beings. What's cool about all of this here, for me anyway, is we're all just these like low-key grassroots individuals who have somehow been tethered together by these pursuits of knowing, and we're all bumping into each other in these digital corridors at some point or another, and it's as if it was bound to happen, right? And we're not scientists for the most part, and not claimed mystics either, but there is indeed some undeniable presence, mystery, novelty emerging from all of this, where, whether it's here with us at the Untold or at our various at the various channels of our compadres here on the YouTube platform, other brethren and co-authors in laying a foundation for sincerity in the pursuit of understanding, at least if not knowing. Knowing that gnosis is not exclusive to these guys, right? But what they did was they tapped into what was available. They first intuited, these grand scientific frameworks that we all take for granted today in the materialist, Ahrimanic kind of impulsive way, right? Newton, we recognize, didn't necessarily experience Apple-induced concussions as a route into Newtonian physics, right? But we can respect that the story serves as a clever double entendre for what Apple hitting his head means. Gravity struck him from an internal, innately, right? He wasn't experimenting in order to discover the idea, right? Something just sort of slapped his cognition cold with new ideation, right? Then he takes to the chalkboards afterwards, right? Confirming his intuitions with calculation, observation, analysis, experimentation, peer review, and all that jazz, right? So Pythagoras was said to have arrived at his Pythagorean theorem in a state of meditation. Einstein, we conceive the same idea, right? Contemplative states. Hawking talked about what is it that breathes the fire into the equations to begin with, right? That was one of his sort of existential questions. And you have this theorem of everything film where, you know, they kind of depict him in this eureka moment while observing the fireplace in his home, which I know, you know, you could just say that it's just dramatization, right? But like, why do we capture these kinds of moments if not that it's a narrative historical bedrock that serves cinematically, like as a cinematic microcosm for the significance that this kind of perspective had in his life, aside from the way we just take for granted the identity of a scientist as just being somebody who writes equations. You know, there's more there. You know, they're staring at the fucking sky. They're staring at the stars. There's noticing the nuances of the living, dynamic world around you, and coming to these intuitive conclusions about its nature, that things like gravity can emerge, that ideas like gravity can then emerge. And, you know, that the question of what breathes the fire into the equation in the first place is a very metacognitive one, considering what's at play to begin with. And these ideas are not for nothing, even if it didn't really objectively happen, right? We get the point here. It's you don't get there from nothing. like in a human way, you know. He says it himself. There's a fire of consciousness in him that's asking the question to begin with that leads to a discovery, right? And so that's all intuitive. Like babies, like Oppenheimer is saying in that initial passage, it's like babies already having topology. They're already master topologists in their own innate development without needing the strict, obscure terminologies that we've attached to the concept, or that we've attached to the understanding, rather. They have that understanding free of concept, nude of any linguistic clothing. The idea here is to return back to that, or to maintain some connection to that honest curiosity that is just innate, that through observation, an essential understanding of reality can just be acquired. This is what gnosis is, but also I would argue that this is what miracle is. It's not seeing crazy stuff like we depict in the movies, right? Well, it is seeing something that's absolutely out of what's intuitively accepted to be possible, but that's just the idea of what miracle is now, because nobody accepts that it's a possibility. But miracle, if you go back into a particular era of time, you know, contextually speaking, miracle is just a casual expression for what it means for somebody to have an innate understanding based on their own observation. You know, to have this immense revelation, you know, a revelatory experience that explains the connection of it all, you know, is gained by this observation that anybody really can just casually experience on their own when they take the time to get reflective, at least, if not contemplative, or if not deeply meditative, right? And this is what the word itself is indicating in its very linguistic construction. You know, mira, right? Seeing, or mirror, for something to reflect back to you, to your observation, to your consciousness. It's not about proving it. It's not about what miracle is. It's not about a proof, but rather about how you saw it. That's all it ever needed to be. Right? Proof ultimately is subordinate to perception in this way of thinking, right? Because from seeing a cut on your finger, experiencing pain, to seeing the nature of heat by staring at fire, or seeing the nature of gravity by observing the natural world around you, no miracle ever really required evidence, or a theory, or hypothesis, or an equation, or a proof. The only thing it ever needed was you.
Well, it is a study of those relationships which do not have to do with measure and size, but with shape and arrangement. Let me digress. We had here this year a French-Swiss psychologist, he is almost a philosopher, called Piaget, whose work has been on the way children learn to think, how they learn notions of cause, notions of time, notions of necessity, notions of number, all the things that Kant thought you were born with. Well, now you're not born with them, you learn them. And he made one discovery which is not surprising, but a little odd. He found out those things which in normal mathematical instruction are the most highbrow, are the things that children know first. Children know first whether objects are inside each other or separate, whether they can be deformed into each other. And these are the notions that topology deals with. They learn later that the length of a line is so, or that a figure has 7 sides and not 6. All the things that have to do with number come later. But the things that have to do with relatedness, the fact that a donut can't be turned into a sphere without tearing it, you see. This kind of thing the child knows, and these logical notions, I mentioned only trivial ones, are the basis of topology.
Tell me this, Dr. Oppenheimer. Do you ever become frightened at what you're finding out here in this area that can't be measured in either time or space?
You see, that's a real point. I only get frightened when, and it happens very rarely, I think I have an idea. That is, what people find isn't frightening, but the understanding of it sometimes has this quality. I remember a man who was my teacher in Göttingen, he's in Chicago now, James Franck. He said, the only way I can tell whether my thoughts are really have some weight is the sense of terror when I think of something new. Well, so the kind of order that will come out of this, that is frightening. But the fact that this, you see, is like walking through the woods and seeing that there are different kinds of flowers, and it's all very amusing. So it's when you try to see why there is necessity, why it's this way and no other way. And you have to try to find the mistakes.
Is it true that humans have already discovered a method of destroying humanity?
Well, I suppose that really has always been true. You could always beat everybody to death. You mean to do it by inadvertence?
Yes.
Not quite. Not quite. This is a matter on which much, much, much more should be known. There's every reason for us to say what we know, and above all to say what we don't know. The genetic problems, the problems of what might happen in the future to the human species as a result of having radioactivity in the body or having radiation outside. The geneticists don't know enough to be sure of that. We do know what happens if you're near an explosion, a bomb explosion. We know it from experience and from common sense. The things we know ought to be in the public domain, so people are fearful only in the measure in which fear is justified and rational. The things that aren't known should be talked about, because one of the ways to get things found out is to have it clear that we don't know the answers, and also one of the ways to give people the kind of responsibility and humanity which we would like, I think we have, is that they recognize when they don't know something and take their very ignorance into account.
It brings me to another one that I wanted to ask very much, and that is that, what about the poor, uninformed civilian?
It isn't the layman that's ignorant. It's everybody that's ignorant. The scientist may know a little patch of something, and if he's a humane and intelligent and curious guy, he'll know a few spots from other people's work. He may even be able to read a book. But his condition is a condition of everyone, which is that almost everything that's known to man, he doesn't know anything about at all, or knows it only in a very sketchy way. And that's because it's gotten a bit complicated. The problem of a coherent civilization is the problem of living with ignorance and not being frustrated by it. So that you find occasionally a man knows two things, and that intersection may be a great event in the history of ideas. Occasionally, a man may think that something is relevant or exciting which no one before thought concerned him professionally. That may change the history of the world. And these are the connections, these virtual connections, these casual and occasional connections, which make the only kind of coherence we have. That and affection, that and respect, that and, I suppose, kind of humanity. Now, if you look at the problem of science and government, then, of course, mostly it's not really science. It's pretty much practical application, because no one in the government of the United States needs to worry about whether the isotopic spin of the strangest number or the real invariance of some atomic work. They need to know sometimes things that are very hard to answer. They need to know all kinds of technical things. And these are not, in the narrow sense, the frontier of science. Some will understand one another in one area, some in another, and you get a kind of lacework of coherence. And that requires, I used the word affection before. For the government, it might be better to say trust. To let almost anyone say what he thinks, to try to give the best synopses, the best popularizations, the best mediations of technical things that you can, and to let men deny what they think is false, argue what they think is false. You have to have a free and uncorrupted communication. And this is so the heart of living in a complicated technological world. It is so the heart of freedom that is why we are all the time saying, does this really have to be secret? Couldn't you say more about that? Are we really acting in a wise way? Not because we enjoy chattering, not because we're not aware of the dangers of the world we live in, but because these dangers cannot be met in any other way.
Well, if I may say so, I think you were speaking there not only for your profession, but for mine, if it is a profession.
I'm sure of that.